Deep in the Austrian Alps, beneath layers of ice and stone that have remained undisturbed for 8 decades, lies one of World War II's most closely guarded secrets. A fortress so well hidden that even the most determined Allied forces never found it. A refuge built for a man who disappeared from history books, leaving behind only whispers and legends. For 80 years, this underground citadel remained buried, its location known only to the mountain winds and the shifting snow. Until a routine geological survey in 2024 uncovered something that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the final days of the Third Reich. What they found wasn't just a bunker. It was an entire underground city, complete with living quarters, command centers, and enough supplies to sustain a small army for years. But more shocking than the facility itself was what lay inside. Documents that revealed the true identity of its occupant, personal belongings that told a story of desperation and cunning, and evidence of an escape so audacious that it defied every historical account we'd ever heard. The man who built this Alpine fortress wasn't just any German officer. He was one of the most wanted war criminals in history, a tactical genius who had orchestrated some of the Wehrmacht's most devastating campaigns. And, according to every textbook, every official record, every Allied intelligence report, he had died in Berlin as the city fell to Soviet forces in May 1945. But the bunker tells a different story, a story of careful planning, impossible odds, and a disappearance so complete that it fooled the entire world for nearly a century. What happened in those mountains during the final weeks of the war wasn't just about one man's survival. It was about secrets that powerful people wanted buried forever, truths that could have changed the course of post-war Europe, and a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of both Allied and Axis command. The discovery of this hidden fortress has sent shockwaves through the historical community, forcing us to question everything we thought we knew about how the war really ended. The story begins not in the Alps, but in the bombed-out streets of Berlin, March 1945. General Friedrich von Steinberg stood at the window of his command bunker, watching Soviet artillery shells tear apart what remained of the German capital. For 3 years, he had been one of Hitler's most trusted field commanders, the architect of defensive strategies that had held back Allied advances far longer than anyone thought possible. His tactical brilliance had earned him the nickname the Mountain Fox among his own troops, a reference to his uncanny ability to vanish into terrain and emerge where the enemy least expected him. But von Steinberg possessed something that set him apart from other German generals. While men like Rommel and Guderian had become household names, celebrated for their bold offensive campaigns, von Steinberg had built his reputation on something far more valuable in the war's final stages. He was a master of the strategic withdrawal, a commander who could make retreat look like victory. His forces had conducted some of the most successful fighting retreats in military history, preserving men and equipment while buying precious time for Germany's collapsing war machine. More importantly, von Steinberg had spent the previous 2 years quietly preparing for what he saw as inevitable. While other Nazi leaders clung to fantasies of miracle weapons and last-minute victories, the general had been methodically planning for Germany's defeat. He had established supply caches across occupied territory, cultivated relationships with Swiss banking contacts, and most crucially, had begun construction of what would become known as Project Edelweiss, a top-secret mountain stronghold designed to serve as the ultimate refuge for high-ranking Nazi officials. The location he had chosen for this fortress was perfect in its isolation. Deep in the Tyrolean Alps, near the border between Austria and Italy, lay a series of natural caves that had been carved by ancient glacial activity. The caverns were accessible only through a narrow mountain pass that could be easily defended or completely sealed. Local records showed that these caves had been used as hideouts during various conflicts throughout history, from medieval bandits to resistance fighters during the Napoleonic Wars. But von Steinberg envisioned something far more ambitious than a simple hiding place. Construction of the bunker had begun in secret during the winter of 1943, disguised as a standard military installation designed to guard against Allied advances from the south. A carefully selected team of engineers, most of them prisoners of war who would never leave the mountain alive, worked around the clock to hollow out the natural caverns and reinforce them with concrete and steel. The project consumed enormous resources at a time when Germany could barely spare materials for essential military operations, but von Steinberg had convinced his superiors that the facility was crucial for defending the Reich's southern borders. What they didn't know was that the general had been diverting supplies and personnel to the project far beyond what any defensive installation required. Hidden chambers were carved deep into the mountain, connected by a maze of tunnels that extended for miles underground. The facility included not just military command centers and barracks, but also extensive storage areas for food and fuel, workshops for maintaining equipment, and even luxury quarters that seemed more suited to a private residence than a military installation. By early 1945, as Allied forces closed in from both east and west, von Steinberg's mountain fortress was nearing completion. The entrance had been camouflaged so expertly that it was virtually invisible from the air, hidden behind a false rock face that could only be opened from inside. Air filtration systems drew fresh air from multiple concealed vents scattered across the mountainside. Underground streams provided a reliable water source, and diesel generators could power the entire facility for months without refueling. But the most remarkable aspect of Project Edelweiss wasn't its construction or its concealment. It was the fact that von Steinberg had managed to stock it with treasures that made it more than just a military hideout. Intelligence reports discovered decades later revealed that the general had been systematically looting occupied territories, not for personal gain, but to create what he called an insurance policy for Germany's future. Art masterpieces stolen from museums across Europe, gold bars taken from conquered banks, and even scientific research documents from German weapons programs had all been transported to the Alpine bunker under cover of military operations. The general's plan was audacious in its scope. He intended to survive the war's end in his mountain stronghold, waiting until the initial chaos of defeat had settled. Then, using the wealth and secrets stored in his bunker, he would emerge to negotiate with whichever Allied power offered him the best terms. He had studied the aftermath of the First World War and understood that the victorious nations would soon turn their attention to the growing threat of Soviet communism. A knowledgeable German general with intimate understanding of Eastern Front tactics and access to valuable intelligence could become a highly sought-after asset in the coming Cold War. Von Steinberg's preparations extended far beyond the physical construction of his refuge. Throughout 1944 and early 1945, he had been carefully selecting personnel who would accompany him into hiding. These weren't just loyal soldiers, but specialists whose skills would be essential for long-term survival and eventual emergence. Engineers who understood the bunker's complex systems, communications experts who could maintain contact with the outside world, and even a small medical team led by a doctor who had previously worked in concentration camps and would ask no uncomfortable questions about the general's wartime activities. The selection process was ruthless and secretive. Candidates were approached individually, usually during routine military transfers that provided cover for their eventual disappearance from official records. They were told only that they had been chosen for a special assignment that would require extended isolation but would ultimately serve the fatherland's interests. Those who expressed reluctance or asked too many questions simply vanished, their fate known only to von Steinberg and his most trusted confidants. By March 1945, with Soviet forces less than 50 miles from Berlin, the general knew his time was running out. His official duties required him to remain in the capital, coordinating the defense of the city's southern approaches. But von Steinberg had no intention of dying for a cause he knew was already lost. The challenge now was executing his escape without alerting either his superiors or his subordinates to his true intentions. Any suspicion of desertion would result in immediate execution, and any evidence of his mountain sanctuary would lead to its discovery and destruction. The general's solution was both simple and brilliant. He would stage his own death during one of the chaotic battles raging around Berlin, using the confusion and destruction to cover his disappearance. It was a plan that required perfect timing and absolute secrecy, but von Steinberg had been preparing for this moment for months. False identity documents had been prepared, civilian clothing had been hidden at strategic locations, and a small team of his most loyal men had already begun moving toward the Alps under cover of legitimate military orders. What happened next would become one of the war's most successful deceptions, a disappearing act so convincing that it fooled not only the Nazi leadership but also Allied intelligence services that spent decades searching for war criminals who were supposedly dead. The discovery of the Alpine bunker 80 years later would finally reveal the truth behind one of history's greatest vanishing acts, but it would also raise disturbing questions about how many other Nazi officials might have successfully escaped justice through similar means. The plan von Steinberg had crafted was set into motion on the night of April 15, 1945. As Soviet artillery pounded the German positions along the Spree River, the general made his final preparations. His official reports to Wehrmacht headquarters indicated that he would personally lead a counterattack against Soviet forces advancing through the southeastern districts of Berlin. It was exactly the kind of desperate, heroic gesture that Nazi propaganda had been demanding from its commanders. What his superiors didn't know was that von Steinberg had already dispatched his most trusted aide, Oberst Klaus Richter, to the Alpine fortress 3 days earlier, with the final shipment of documents and gold. The staged death was executed with military precision. During a particularly intense bombardment near Tempelhof Airport, von Steinberg's command vehicle was reported destroyed by a direct hit from Soviet tanks. Witnesses, all carefully selected by the general, testified that they had seen his body thrown from the burning vehicle. In the chaos of the battle, with fires raging and debris scattered across the battlefield, no one questioned why the body was never recovered. The official report listed General Friedrich von Steinberg as killed in action while defending the Reich capital. But von Steinberg was already miles away, traveling south through the German countryside in a stolen Wehrmacht truck. He had shed his uniform for the simple clothes of a displaced civilian, complete with forged papers identifying him as a refugee fleeing the advancing Soviet forces. The transformation was remarkable. The proud general who had commanded thousands of men had become just another anonymous figure in the stream of humanity desperately seeking safety in the war's final days. The journey to the Alps took nearly 2 weeks, a treacherous passage through a Germany that was collapsing all around him. Allied bombers controlled the skies during daylight hours, forcing von Steinberg to travel only at night. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly from the east, while American and British troops pushed in from the west, leaving an ever-narrowing corridor of German-controlled territory. Twice, the general's truck was stopped at military checkpoints, but his false papers and convincing performance as a frightened refugee allowed him to pass without suspicion. The most dangerous moment came near Nuremberg, where von Steinberg encountered a group of SS officers who were executing deserters and civilians suspected of defeatism. The general found himself forced to watch as men who had once served under him were shot without trial, their only crime being their desire to survive the war's end. It was a chilling reminder that his own deception, if discovered, would result in immediate execution. But von Steinberg's nerves held steady. He had spent too many years commanding men in impossible situations to be rattled by the sight of death. By early May 1945, as news of Hitler's suicide spread across what remained of the Third Reich, von Steinberg finally reached the Alpine region where his fortress waited. The landscape had changed dramatically since his last visit to oversee the bunker's construction. Allied bombing raids had targeted railway lines and bridges, leaving the mountain valleys scarred with craters and twisted metal. Refugee camps had sprouted around every town and village, filled with displaced persons from across Eastern Europe. The local population, once proud supporters of the Nazi regime, now lived in terror of advancing Allied forces and the inevitable occupation that would follow. The general made contact with his advance team through a pre-arranged signal system involving coded messages left at a small church in a village 15 miles from the bunker entrance. The response came within hours. Oberst Richter and the carefully selected personnel had successfully reached the mountain fortress and were awaiting his arrival. The bunker's systems were fully operational, supplies were properly stored, and the entrance remained undetected despite increased Allied patrol activity in the region. The final approach to the hidden fortress required a grueling climb through terrain that would have challenged experienced mountaineers. Von Steinberg, despite his excellent physical condition, found himself struggling with the altitude and the weight of the equipment he carried. The path wound through dense forests and across treacherous rocky slopes, following routes that had been carefully mapped during the bunker's construction phase. Every step had to be planned to avoid leaving traces that might be spotted by Allied reconnaissance aircraft or patrol units. The entrance to the bunker was a masterpiece of camouflage engineering. What appeared to be a natural rock formation was actually a carefully constructed facade that concealed blast doors capable of withstanding direct artillery hits. The opening mechanism required knowledge of a complex sequence of hidden switches and pressure points scattered across the false rock face. Even someone who knew the general location of the entrance would need detailed instructions to actually gain access to the facility. When von Steinberg finally entered his Alpine stronghold on May 8, 1945, the same day that Germany officially surrendered, he found a fully functioning underground city. The main command center buzzed with activity as his hand-picked team monitored radio communications from across Europe. Intelligence reports were being compiled and analyzed, tracking the movements of Allied occupation forces and documenting the locations of other Nazi officials who had successfully escaped capture. The general's mountain fortress had become the nerve center for what would later be called the Odessa Network, a secret organization dedicated to helping war criminals disappear into new lives. The living quarters that von Steinberg had designed for himself were surprisingly luxurious, resembling a wealthy businessman's private retreat more than a military bunker. Persian rugs covered the floors, artwork stolen from museums across Europe decorated the walls, and a private library contained thousands of books on subjects ranging from military strategy to philosophy. The general had even included a small wine cellar stocked with vintage bottles appropriated from French chateaux during the occupation. It was clear that he had intended his exile to be as comfortable as possible. But comfort was not von Steinberg's primary concern during those first weeks in the bunker. Intelligence reports indicated that Allied forces were conducting systematic searches for high-ranking Nazi officials, using captured documents and witness testimony to track down war criminals. The general's staged death had bought him valuable time, but he knew that eventually investigators might begin to question the circumstances of his supposed demise. The bunker had to remain absolutely secret, and any evidence of its existence had to be eliminated. The most pressing concern was the disposal of the construction workers who had built the facility. These men, mostly Soviet prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates, possessed detailed knowledge of the bunker's location and layout. Von Steinberg had always planned to eliminate them once construction was complete, but the rapid collapse of Germany had complicated the timeline. Now, with Allied investigators actively searching for war criminals, the general could not risk any witnesses surviving to testify about Project Edelweiss. The solution was swift and ruthless. Over the course of 3 nights in mid-May 1945, small teams of von Steinberg's most trusted men systematically hunted down and eliminated every worker who had participated in the bunker's construction. The killings were made to look like random violence in the chaotic aftermath of Germany's defeat, another tragic consequence of the war's brutality. Bodies were scattered across the Alpine region, their deaths attributed to deserting soldiers, desperate refugees, or vengeful foreign workers settling old scores. With the witnesses eliminated, von Steinberg turned his attention to establishing the long-term operations that would sustain his hidden organization. The bunker's communication systems allowed him to maintain contact with a network of former Nazi officials who had escaped to South America, Switzerland, and other neutral countries. These men formed the core of what would become a sophisticated smuggling operation, helping wanted war criminals disappear, while also moving stolen Nazi gold and artwork to secure locations around the world. The general's intelligence background proved invaluable during this period. He understood how Allied investigators operated, what evidence they would be seeking, and how to create false trails that would lead them away from his true location. Forged documents were produced in the bunker's workshops, creating new identities for escaped Nazis, while also spreading disinformation about their whereabouts. Some of these fabricated reports even reached Allied intelligence services, sending investigators on wild chases across Europe and South America, while the real fugitives remained safely hidden. By the winter of 1945, von Steinberg's Alpine fortress had evolved into something far more significant than a simple hiding place. It had become the secret headquarters for a shadow organization that would influence post-war Europe for decades to come. The general himself had transformed from a fleeing war criminal into the puppet master of an underground network that reached into governments, banks, and intelligence agencies across the Western world. The man who was officially dead had become more powerful in hiding than he had ever been while wearing a Wehrmacht uniform. The transformation of von Steinberg's bunker into a nerve center for escaped Nazi officials wasn't just about survival. It was about rebuilding power from the shadows. As winter settled over the Alps in late 1945, the general found himself coordinating an operation that stretched across 3 continents. His communication equipment, some of the most advanced technology available at the time, allowed him to maintain contact with cells operating in Argentina, Switzerland, Vatican City, and even occupied Germany itself. The Vatican connection proved particularly valuable. Several high-ranking church officials, motivated by anti-communist sentiment rather than Nazi sympathy, had quietly begun facilitating the escape of German officers who might prove useful against the growing Soviet threat. Von Steinberg's network provided these officials with detailed intelligence about which fugitives possessed valuable military knowledge and which were simply war criminals seeking to avoid prosecution. The Church's extensive international presence made it an ideal conduit for moving people and resources without attracting Allied attention. But the general's most audacious operation involved infiltrating the very organizations that were hunting him. By early 1946, von Steinberg had successfully placed former Wehrmacht intelligence officers within the emerging West German security services. These men, operating under carefully constructed new identities, fed information back to the Alpine bunker about ongoing investigations into Nazi war crimes. The irony was perfect. The people searching for von Steinberg were unknowingly being monitored by his own agents. The bunker's workshops had become sophisticated forgery operations, producing not just identity documents but also historical records designed to obscure the truth about wartime activities. Birth certificates, military service records, and even academic credentials were created with such precision that they fooled government bureaucrats across Europe. Some of these documents were so convincing that they remained undiscovered for decades, only coming to light when modern computer databases began cross-referencing information that had previously been stored in separate filing systems. Von Steinberg's personal transformation during this period was remarkable. The man who had once commanded armored divisions now spent his days hunched over radio equipment and coded messages, orchestrating operations he would never see firsthand. His hair had gone completely gray, and the stress of constant vigilance had aged him beyond his years. But his mind remained sharp, perhaps sharper than ever. The general had discovered that he possessed a talent for this shadow war that exceeded even his abilities as a field commander. The wealth stored in the bunker played a crucial role in sustaining these operations. Nazi gold, converted into Swiss francs and American dollars through a network of compliant bankers, funded everything from forged documents to safe houses in remote locations. Stolen artwork was quietly sold through art dealers who asked no questions about provenance, generating steady income streams that could support fugitive networks for decades. Von Steinberg had essentially created a criminal enterprise with the resources of a small nation. The general's psychological profile during this period, later reconstructed from documents found in the bunker, revealed a man who had convinced himself that he was serving a higher purpose. In his private journals, discovered decades later, von Steinberg wrote extensively about his belief that he was preserving valuable military knowledge for the inevitable conflict with the Soviet Union. He viewed his network not as a criminal organization, but as a strategic asset that Western powers would eventually recognize and appreciate. This delusion was reinforced by the changing geopolitical landscape. As the Cold War intensified, some Western intelligence agencies did indeed begin recruiting former Nazi officials for their expertise in fighting communist forces. Operation Paperclip brought German scientists to America, while similar programs in Britain and France absorbed specialists whose wartime activities were quietly overlooked. Von Steinberg monitored these developments carefully, believing that his moment for legitimate rehabilitation was approaching. But the general's confidence proved to be his greatest weakness. By 1947, his network had grown so extensive that maintaining absolute secrecy became increasingly difficult. Too many people knew too many details about operations that should have remained compartmentalized. Messages between cells were intercepted by Allied intelligence services, though the true significance of these communications wouldn't be understood for years. The sheer scale of von Steinberg's organization was creating vulnerabilities that no amount of careful planning could eliminate. The first serious threat to the bunker's security came from an unexpected source. A former concentration camp guard named Heinrich Müller, who had been providing security for one of von Steinberg's South American operations, was captured by British intelligence officers in Buenos Aires. Under interrogation, Müller revealed details about the escape network that led investigators back toward the Alpine region. Though he didn't know the exact location of the bunker, his information provided enough clues to narrow the search area significantly. Von Steinberg's response was characteristically ruthless. Within weeks of Müller's capture, 3 other network members who had possessed similar knowledge were found dead in apparent accidents across Europe. The general's elimination protocol, designed to protect the bunker's location at all costs, had been activated. But these deaths also created new problems. Allied investigators began noticing patterns in the supposedly random violence, patterns that suggested a coordinated effort to silence witnesses. The pressure intensified throughout 1948 as Allied intelligence services began sharing information more systematically. What had once been separate investigations by different national agencies were now being coordinated through joint task forces, specifically designed to track down war criminals. Von Steinberg found himself fighting a multi-front intelligence war while trapped in his mountain fortress, unable to directly oversee the operations that were crucial to his survival. The general's isolation was becoming a significant handicap. While his radio communications allowed him to receive reports and issue orders, he couldn't assess situations with the precision that field command required. Agents in the field were making decisions based on incomplete information, and the network's efficiency was deteriorating. Von Steinberg began to realize that his perfect hiding place might also become his tomb if he couldn't find a way to operate more effectively from the shadows. The solution he developed was both innovative and dangerous. Rather than remaining permanently hidden in the bunker, von Steinberg began making carefully planned excursions into the outside world. Using the extensive collection of forged documents his workshop had produced, he adopted multiple identities that allowed him to travel throughout Europe under deep cover. To the outside world, he appeared to be various businessmen, academic researchers, or displaced persons still dealing with the war's aftermath. These missions allowed the general to personally oversee critical operations and assess threats that couldn't be properly evaluated through radio communications alone. He would spend weeks at a time away from the bunker, living in safe houses and conducting face-to-face meetings with key network members. The risk was enormous. A single mistake, one moment of recognition, would expose not only von Steinberg himself, but the entire organization he had built. The general's first major excursion took him to Switzerland in the autumn of 1948. Where he needed to personally negotiate with bankers who were threatening to freeze accounts linked to his network. Swiss authorities had begun investigating suspicious financial transactions, and several bank officials were demanding proof that their clients weren't wanted war criminals. Von Steinberg, disguised as an Austrian businessman dealing with war reparations, spent 3 weeks in Zurich managing a crisis that could have destroyed his organization's financial foundation. The mission was successful, but it revealed how much the world had changed since his disappearance. The Europe von Steinberg encountered during his secret travels was nothing like the continent he had known during the war. Cities were rebuilding, new governments were establishing themselves, and most importantly, the systematic search for Nazi war criminals was becoming more sophisticated and determined. The general realized that his window of opportunity for eventual rehabilitation was closing faster than he had anticipated. More disturbing was the discovery that other Nazi fugitives were beginning to crack under pressure. Klaus Barbie had been captured in Bolivia, Adolf Eichmann was rumored to be hiding in Argentina but under constant surveillance, and dozens of lower-ranking officials were being discovered and prosecuted across Europe. Each capture provided Allied investigators with new information about escape networks and hidden assets. Von Steinberg's carefully constructed organization was being dismantled piece by piece, even as he struggled to maintain control from his Alpine sanctuary. The general's response was to accelerate his timeline dramatically. Rather than waiting for the perfect moment to emerge from hiding, he began preparing for a permanent relocation that would take him far from Europe and beyond the reach of war crimes investigators. South America remained the most promising destination, but von Steinberg had learned from the mistakes of other fugitives. Simply disappearing into the Argentine countryside wouldn't be sufficient. He needed a new identity so complete, so thoroughly documented, that it could withstand any level of scrutiny. The creation of this ultimate false identity became von Steinberg's most ambitious project yet. Working with master forgers in his bunker's workshops, he began constructing not just documents, but an entire fictional life history that stretched back decades. The identity he chose was that of Klaus Hoffmann, a German-Swiss engineering professor who had supposedly spent the war years in neutral Switzerland, quietly conducting research on Alpine geology. The backstory was brilliant in its mundane complexity, detailed enough to satisfy investigators but boring enough to discourage deeper scrutiny. Every aspect of Hoffmann's fictional existence was carefully crafted. University records were created showing his academic career, complete with published papers on obscure geological topics that few people would ever bother to verify. Employment documents detailed his work for Swiss engineering firms on projects that had genuinely existed but involved enough personnel that one additional name wouldn't raise suspicions. Even personal touches were added, including photographs showing Hoffmann at family gatherings with people who were actually paid actors, their images carefully integrated into existing family albums purchased from estate sales. The physical transformation required to become Klaus Hoffmann was equally meticulous. Von Steinberg underwent subtle cosmetic procedures performed by a disgraced German surgeon who had joined his network to escape prosecution for medical experiments. The general's distinctive facial features were altered just enough to change his appearance without making the modifications obvious. His hair was dyed and styled differently, he adopted new mannerisms and speech patterns, and he even learned to walk with a slight limp that would explain any remaining traces of his military bearing. But the most crucial element of the transformation was psychological. Von Steinberg spent months studying academic culture, learning the vocabulary and concerns of university professors, practicing the kind of intellectual discussions that would be expected from someone in Hoffman's position. He memorized details about Swiss geography, politics, and culture that would allow him to pass as a lifelong resident. The general, who had once commanded tank divisions, now spent his days rehearsing lectures about sedimentary rock formations and glacial erosion patterns. By the spring of 1949, Klaus Hoffmann was ready to enter the world. Von Steinberg's emergence from hiding was gradual and carefully orchestrated. Hoffmann first appeared in academic circles in Geneva, presenting a paper at a geological conference about Alpine cave formations. The irony was perfect. A former Nazi general giving lectures about the very type of terrain where he had been hiding for 4 years. His presentation was well received, and several colleagues mentioned that they looked forward to seeing more of his research. The transition from bunker dweller to respected academic proceeded smoothly through 1949 and into 1950. Hoffmann secured a position at the University of Lausanne, teaching courses on geological engineering while supposedly conducting field research in remote Alpine locations. This cover story was ideal because it explained his frequent absences when he needed to return to the bunker to coordinate network operations. To his colleagues, Professor Hoffmann was simply a dedicated researcher who preferred the solitude of mountain fieldwork to the politics of university life. What none of his academic colleagues suspected was that Hoffmann's geological expeditions were actually intelligence-gathering missions. Von Steinberg used his legitimate access to remote Alpine regions to establish new safe houses and communication centers for his fugitive network. University funding even helped pay for equipment that was ostensibly for geological research but actually served to expand his surveillance capabilities across the region. The general had found the perfect cover for continuing his shadow war against Allied investigators. The network's operations during this period grew increasingly sophisticated. Von Steinberg had learned from the mistakes that led to earlier captures of Nazi fugitives. Instead of maintaining large, centralized organizations that could be easily compromised, he created smaller, independent cells that operated without knowledge of each other's activities. Communication between cells was limited and conducted through elaborate dead-drop systems that made infiltration nearly impossible. The general's academic position also provided unexpected opportunities for recruitment. Several of his colleagues had family members or friends who had served in the Wehrmacht or SS, people who were living quietly under their real names but feared eventual prosecution. Von Steinberg carefully cultivated these relationships, gradually identifying individuals who might be useful to his organization while maintaining his cover as an apolitical academic interested only in geological research. But the most significant development during this period was von Steinberg's growing influence within legitimate Swiss institutions. His expertise in Alpine geology made him a valuable consultant for government projects involving mountain infrastructure development. Through these contracts, the general gained access to official documentation systems and established relationships with bureaucrats who could facilitate document forgeries without realizing they were being manipulated. The success of the Klaus Hoffmann identity convinced von Steinberg that his ultimate survival strategy was working perfectly. By 1951, he had achieved something that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The most wanted Nazi war criminal in Allied custody had transformed himself into a respected member of Swiss academic society. His colleagues valued his expertise. His students appreciated his thorough, if somewhat dry, teaching style, and government officials sought his advice on technical matters involving Alpine engineering projects. The discovery of von Steinberg's Alpine fortress in 2024 shattered one of history's most successful deceptions. For nearly 8 decades, the world believed that General Friedrich von Steinberg had died defending Berlin. The truth was far more chilling. His underground empire had operated in plain sight, hidden behind academic respectability and Swiss neutrality. The bunker's sealed chambers contained evidence of a network that helped hundreds of war criminals escape justice, funded by stolen treasures, and protected by legitimate institutions that never suspected they were harboring one of the Third Reich's most cunning survivors. What other secrets remain buried in remote mountains, waiting for the next geological survey to expose truths that powerful people hoped would stay hidden forever? This story was intense. But this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.